Marlins Park opened in Miami in April 2012 as the new home of the Miami Marlins, constructed at a total cost of approximately $634 million, with Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami contributing approximately $409 million in public financing structured through hotel tax revenue bonds and city capital funding, with total debt service estimated at approximately $2.4 billion over 40 years. In November 2017, 5 years after the stadium opened, the Miami Marlins were sold by Jeffrey Loria to a group led by Derek Jeter and Bruce Sherman for approximately $1.2 billion. The sale price was approximately twice the franchise's estimated value at the time the public financing was approved. The public subsidy that had been justified by the argument that the Marlins required a new stadium to remain viable in Miami had contributed to a franchise value appreciation that was monetized by the original owner through a private sale that the public entities whose financing had enabled the appreciation had no mechanism to share in. The forensic entry point for this case is the specific institutional mechanism by which a public subsidy justified by the threat of franchise relocation produced franchise value appreciation that accrued entirely to the private owner rather than to the public entities whose financing had contributed to the appreciation, and whose monetization through a franchise sale eliminated the accountability rationale for the subsidy's original approval. The public argument for the Marlins Stadium subsidy was retention. Without a new stadium, the franchise would relocate, depriving Miami of Major League Baseball and of the economic activity and civic identity that a professional baseball franchise provides to its home market. That argument was accepted by the Miami-Dade County Commission in a process whose transparency and deliberativeness have been subjects of sustained criticism in the Miami community. The franchise was retained, the stadium was built, the franchise value doubled, the franchise was sold. The retention argument that justified the subsidy produced the retention for 5 years before the subsidy's contribution to franchise value appreciation was monetized by the owner the subsidy had been designed to retain. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Miami-Dade County Commission's approval of the Marlins Stadium financing in 2009 reflected the specific political economy of professional sports facility subsidies that has produced stadium financing agreements in American cities for 6 decades. The combination of franchise owner relocation threats, real or implied, with the political system's inability to credibly commit to allowing a franchise to leave, creating a bargaining dynamic that consistently produces public subsidies larger than independent economic analysis of the stadium's public benefit would justify. The Marlins' ownership under Jeffrey Loria had documented through 2 decades of operation at Sun Life Stadium that the franchise's financial performance at a shared multi-purpose venue was inadequate for the competitive spending that Major League Baseball's economic structure required to field a consistently competitive team in a market with Miami's demographic and economic characteristics. The argument that a new baseball-specific stadium would transform the Marlins' financial performance was plausible in the abstract, and was not subjected to adequate independent financial scrutiny before the public financing was approved. The covenant that the Miami-Dade County Commission's financing approval did not contain was the one restricting the franchise owner's ability to sell the franchise within a specified period following the public subsidy's approval and to retain the full appreciation in franchise value that the public subsidy had contributed to generating. That covenant is not a standard feature of professional sports facility financing agreements in American cities. Its absence is the structural characteristic of the public-private partnership framework for sports facility development that the Marlins case documents with unusual specificity. The public entity accepts the risk of the franchise's departure and provides the subsidy required to eliminate that risk, while the private owner retains all the value appreciation that the public subsidy contributes to generating, including the appreciation that is monetized through a subsequent sale to a different owner. The franchise was not stolen from Miami. The franchise was sold as the owner was entitled to sell it under the ownership structure that the public financing had preserved. The public entities whose financing had contributed to the franchise value's doubling were not entitled to share in the proceeds of that doubling under the terms of any agreement they had negotiated. At what point does a public subsidy for private franchise retention require a public equity stake in the franchise value it is designed to preserve? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that governed the Miami-Dade County Commission's evaluation of the Marlins Stadium financing produced an economic impact analysis whose projections treated the stadium and the franchise as sources of public economic benefit that justified the public investment without quantifying the private value appreciation that the public investment would contribute to generating. That asymmetry between public benefit quantification and private value quantification is the standard appraisal framework for professional sports facility financing in American cities, and it is the framework that produces the consistent pattern documented across the professional sports facility finance literature. Public entities fund facilities whose primary long-term financial beneficiary is the private franchise owner whose team occupies the facility. The independent economic analysis of sports facility public subsidies consistently finds that the projected economic impacts are substantially overstated and that the actual public economic benefits generated by sports facilities are significantly lower than the financing justification analyses project. The Miami Stadium's economic impact analysis projected job creation, tax revenue generation, and ancillary economic activity at levels that independent analysts characterized as optimistic. The franchise value appreciation from approximately $600 million at the time of the public financing approval to approximately $1.2 billion at the time of the 2017 sale was not projected, discussed, or accounted for in the economic impact analysis, because the economic impact analysis was designed to justify the public investment rather than to comprehensively evaluate the private value that the public investment would contribute to generating. The $409 million in public financing contributed to a franchise value increase of approximately $600 million. An appreciation that the private owner monetized through the sale. The public entities that contributed to that appreciation received 40 years of bond service obligations and the continued presence of Major League Baseball in Miami. The private owner received approximately $1.2 billion from the sale, departing with the appreciation that the public financing had contributed to generating, while the public entities continued to service the debt, whose repayment will require approximately $2.4 billion over 40 years. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Miami-Dade County Commission's approval process for the Marlins Stadium financing has been documented through investigative journalism and subsequent legal proceedings as failing to meet the transparency and deliberative standards that a 40-year, $409 million public commitment requires. The Commission's access to independent financial analysis of the franchise owner's actual need for public subsidy, of the owner's financial capacity to contribute a larger share of the construction cost, and of the public entity's rights in any subsequent franchise sale was limited in ways that independent analysts characterized as incompatible with responsible due diligence for a commitment of this scale and duration. The institutional denial is therefore distributed across two distinct dimensions of the case. The first is the economic impact dimension, the acceptance of optimistic economic impact projections whose assumptions were not independently validated and whose private value appreciation mechanism, the franchise value doubling that the public financing would contribute to generating, was not modeled, disclosed, or addressed in the financing's public justification. The second is the process dimension, the absence of the independent scrutiny, the adequate deliberation period, and the structural provisions, public equity participation, sale restriction covenants, or recapture mechanisms that would have aligned the public financing's terms with the public interest the financing was supposed to serve. Neither failure was the product of individual bad faith. Both were the product of a professional sports facility financing framework that American public finance has not yet developed the institutional mechanisms to address, because the political economy of franchise relocation threats consistently produces public commitments that the deliberative process is structurally ill-equipped to evaluate on terms that fully account for the private value the public financing generates. The Marlins are still in Miami. The stadium is operational. The bonds are being serviced over 40 years at an estimated total cost of $2.4 billion. Jeffrey Loria sold the franchise for $1.2 billion in 2017. Every one of those facts is the product of a system working exactly as it was designed. The design is the forensic finding. The specific provision that would have changed the outcome was the one requiring the franchise owner to either retain the franchise for the full term of the public debt or to remit to the public entities the proportional share of franchise value appreciation attributable to the public financing upon any earlier sale. No such provision exists in American sports facility finance. Its absence is not an oversight, it is the standard. And the Marlins case is the most precisely documented measurement of what that standard costs the public entities that comply with it. Marlins Park continues to operate as the home of the Miami Marlins under the ownership of the Derek Jeter and Bruce Sherman Group, which acquired the franchise in 2017 and has managed it through a rebuilding period whose competitive and financial characteristics reflect the specific challenges of operating a Major League Baseball franchise in the Miami market. The public financing that enabled the stadium's construction continues to be serviced through the hotel tax revenue and city capital mechanisms approved by the Miami-Dade County Commission in 2009, with debt service payments scheduled through the mid-2040s. What the Marlins Park case reveals in the context of this channel's 59-case archive is the specific category of public finance failure that professional sports facility subsidies represent. Not a failure of construction or operational execution, but a failure of public finance structure in which the public entities that provide the financing accept the risk of franchise departure and fund the facility whose construction eliminates that risk, while the private owner retains all the franchise value appreciation that the public financing contributes to generating. The Tropicana case in case file 029 documented what happens when a public subsidy drives the demolition of a historic casino. The Silverdome case in case file 030 documented what happens when a public stadium investment is abandoned by the franchise it was built to retain. The Marlins Park case documents what happens when a public stadium investment successfully retains the franchise for 5 years before the franchise is sold at a price reflecting the public financing's contribution to franchise value appreciation. All three cases are different expressions of the same forensic proposition, that the public finance of private sports franchises transfers risk to public entities and value appreciation to private owners, and that the specific transaction structures the American public finance system has developed for professional sports facilities do not contain the provisions that would align those transfers with the public interest that authorizes the subsidy. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between public stadium subsidies and private franchise value in professional sports finance, subscribe because the next case examines a stadium whose public finance was structured differently and produced a different outcome for a different reason. And in the comments, given the Marlins franchise's documented sale for $1.2 billion 5 years after a $409 million public subsidy was approved on the grounds of franchise retention, what specific provision in the financing agreement would have most effectively protected the public interest in the franchise value appreciation that the public financing contributed to generating? The case file is open.